Welcome to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast. Each week, we'll be joined by educational experts from across the globe, offering exclusive insights, inspiration, and guidance to help practitioners unlock the potential for learning in the early years. Hello, my name is Dr. Shaddai Tembo, your host for this week's TTS Talking Early Years podcast. I am a lecturer in early childhood studies at Aston University, an associate lecturer at the Open University, a trustee for the Fatherhood Institute, and an independent writer, speaker, and consultant for critical early years. Now, throughout this series, we'll be exploring representation in the early years, inspiring you with guidance on ways to be more inclusive in your practice through covering topics such as cultural and gender diversity. And on that note, I'm delighted to introduce Gina Rippon as today's guest. Now, before we get started, perhaps you could give an introduction to yourself for the readers, the listeners.
Okay. My name's Gina Rippon. I'm a Professor Emeritus of Cognitive Neuroimaging, bit of a mouthful, at Aston University in Birmingham. And I work in a brain imaging centre, particularly focusing on developmental disorders such as dyslexia and autism. And I'm really interested in how brains get to be different. A lot of the sort of early phases of neuroscience was looking at, what's everybody's brain like? So I'm actually interested in how brains get to be different. And as a consequence of that, obviously, if I'm looking at developmental disorders, that is of interest. But I also got drawn into the whole world of what's called sex differences in the brain or gender differences in the brain. And I've spent a lot of time talking about that in public. And in 2019, wrote a book called The Gendered Brain, which was really looking at what neuroscience had to say about differences between the brains of women and the brains of men, whether there were any and where did they come from and what did they mean.
Thanks, Gina. Now, today I'll be asking you to delve into the neuroscience behind gender and play-based learning. But I think the best place to start off this conversation is with an understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about gender and sex. Perhaps you could offer your interpretation and understanding for listeners.
Right. I think that's really important because I think the terms are misused quite a lot, particularly the term gender. So when I talk about sex differences in the brain, I talk about biologically based differences. So I'm assuming those are biologically determined differences which are related to what Daphne Joel has called the 3 Gs, so genes, genitals and gonads. So that particular aspect of our biology, which produces different reproductive systems, but may also impact on the structures of our brains. So that's a strict biological definition. And I would point out that actually that's until the 1980s, that was the only term that was used to talk about differences between males and females. It was assumed that they knew biologically there were differences between males and females, but they also assumed that there were different kinds of skill sets that females and males had. So experimental psychologists helpfully weighed in and produced a go-to list of females are verbal and males are spatial and a whole list of classic differences that people believe in. And it was also assumed that there were sex roles in society. So you had a different role in society, possibly based on the skills you had, but more likely at that stage based on the expectations that society had of you. And then in the 1980s, particularly with the second wave of feminism, there was this idea that we should distinguish between what society expected of women and men and what biology determined that women and men could do, because there was felt that there was a disconnect. So very much there was an emphasis on what was then called gender roles. So the idea was that, the concepts like lady doctor, for example, and things like that, was the idea that men and women did do different jobs, and you could quite easily see that there were different expectations, and there are even laws associated with it. Married women couldn't stay in the civil service and things like that. So those were very much socially determined. So, and I think gender, at that point, it was quite clear we were talking about a gender construction. And then the concept of gender has kind of shifted. So what we used to call sex differences, we now talk about gender differences. We talk about gender pay gaps, but actually they are differences between the wages that women are given and the wages that men are given. So gender kind of came to apply to all what we used to call sex differences. And I think it's important that we realize that people use those terms differently. And sometimes even in neuroscience, you can come across people talking about gender differences because they've divided their population into males and females and measured their brains. And it's important to know what they mean. And just to continue with the final definition, it's now realized that biology and social determinants are very much entangled. So sometimes we talk about sex/gender or gender/sex as a single term, meaning you can't really disentangle them because the way in which society brings children up, the expectations they have of males and females is so much entangled with what happens in the brain, and the brain will change according to that. So just to introduce a third term, sex gender is another way of thinking about what we're talking about.
Thank you for that, Gina. It's really important that we get those fundamental concepts right, isn't it? And have that clear understanding for readers. I think you point towards those changes in the 1980s, the second wave of feminism, and much beforehand. So this isn't really a new conversation we're having about those differences between men and women within society. Why are gender-based differences so pervasive today?
They've been around for a very long time. I think that's part of the aspect. I mean, if you look at, well, certainly the early years of studies of the brain, way back at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, it wasn't a question of whether males and females had different brains. It was a given, and the early researchers actually set out to prove that differences, and they were really trying to demonstrate how their science could support what was actually a status quo in society, that males and females had different roles in society. And certainly at that stage, women had inferior roles in society, legally imposed, if you like. They weren't allowed to own property, have independent financial support, etc. So the early scientists were saying, we're looking for an inferior brain. What is it that makes women's brains inferior? And there's all sorts of very amusing, at a distance, stories about how male scientists were desperately trying to prove why women were inferior and men would always be superior. That was something that was determined by nature, and as a consequence, not something we should be messing around with.
Yeah, absolutely. So those real changes we've had in, I guess, the neuroscience and those more recent developments have really contributed towards a much more contemporary understanding of gender and sex in today's society. But I know that in your book, you talk about a number of kind of neurotrash and brain myths that often occur when we talk about gender and sex. Perhaps you could speak to those a little bit more. Right.
Well, I think the trouble was that all the theories we had about the differences between male and female brains and male and female behavior, male and female places in society, were actually based on assumptions, because in the early years, we couldn't actually look at the brain. You could obviously see the consequences of brain damage, or you might be able to look at a brain, a dead brain, at autopsy, etc., and draw conclusions about what you found. But we couldn't actually look at intact living human brains in intact living humans until really the 1980s, 1990s, when brain imaging became much more accessible, affordable, and brain researchers really started to revisit the questions that had been left unanswered, if you like, in the early years of understanding what role the brain had to play in human behavior. But unfortunately, what happened was that the early neuroscientists were using their imaging skills to support the existing myths, if you like. So there was an idea that women were more verbal and men were more spatial. So a lot of the early studies was actually saying, well, let's see, why that is the case. Let's have a look at brains and prove that, oh gosh, look, women use both sides of the brain in language, or men only use one side to process complex geometric shapes, etc. So neuroscientists contributed from the beginning to the idea that there was a difference. And I call it the Hunt the Difference agenda. And at that point, it tapped in very nicely with, I think, some of the backlash against the sort of early feminist arguments, whereby there was a tide of these sort of self-help books of the classic men are from Mars, women are from Venus type genre, where you got these self-help gurus saying, you know, we've said all along that men and women are different, and they tended to be relationship advisors and careers advisors and things, and said, hey, look at these wonderful images, because what happened with the new imaging techniques was somebody had the brilliant marketing idea that instead of just collecting signals and reporting the numbers, let's change these numbers into visual displays. So you get the very kind of, as they're literally called, seductive images, where it looked as though brain was lighting up in different parts. And so you could say, oh, look, that's what happens when somebody's thinking about whatever it was you wanted to prove was where it was in the brain. So you got a combination of these lovely images, which were actually much more complicated than they appeared, being cheerfully hijacked by people who really didn't understand what they were showing. And they were used to illustrate books. And people were, you know, there was literally in the sort of first 10, 12 years of this century, a whole huge tranche of books. And they were always called things like, you know, why men don't cry and women can't read maps. And they always had probably on the cover, a picture of a brain with a red and a blue spot in it or something like that. And that's what I call neurotrash, because it was really a misrepresentation of what was being shown. And there was also, you know, the neuroscientists themselves were sometimes got a bit carried away with, you know, publishing papers and talking about fundamental differences without explaining that actually they were looking at very small numbers. Early brain imaging studies were done on about a dozen people, probably your mates in the lab or something anyway. And without sort of any kind of buyer beware or government health warning saying we are only talking about a small number of people, and actually there's a big overlap in the differences we found, because that doesn't tell such an interesting story. So I think everybody got carried away in the early years about, oh, look, you know, we found at last the truth. You know, those are the kind of headlines you tended to get in the public press, you know, the mainstream press, who were thrilled, you know, with the idea that, oh, look, at last we can see what's going on in the brain and prove what we've known, you know, since the beginning of time, that men and women are different, and sometimes an unspoken, and men are better than women, but let's not get into that.
Yeah, that's really interesting what you're saying about how the early scientists really sought to naturalize and perpetuate those differences in gender within their research. I guess in part, as you say, that's supported by media and the press, who also sought to kind of trivialize and essentialize those differences in the sorts of books we saw in the early 2000s. More practically then, what are the effects of gender in today's society? Is this still a real issue for people? Does it still shape their lives and the ways in which they work and live? How much of an effect does gender have in today's society?
Enormous. Enormous. I mean, the World Health Organization produces a global gender gap index every year. And they have particular measures of gender equality in, I think it's about 160 countries now. And the most recent one has just come out. And what it actually does is looks at every different country. There's 4 different measures: political representation, financial independence, access to education, healthcare, etc. Generates a measure and says, you know, are males and females equally represented on these measures throughout the world? To which, surprise, surprise, the answer is no. In no country are males and females equally represented on these measures. Iceland, I think for the 14th year running, has just come first. So they do quite well, but there is still a gap. And the other slightly scary thing is that they've actually, because they've now been doing it, I think for about 15 or 16 years, they can actually look at the rate of change. So they generate a sort of single metric. I mean, can be arguments about that for each country, and say how much has it changed over the years. And at this rate of change, at what point will the world reach true gender equality? And just before the pandemic, in the 2019 report, it was going to take 99.1 years, so nearly 100 years.
Wow.
And then after the next 3 years, after the pandemic, it went up a whole generation. So we're now looking at 130 plus years. So I think that tells a really worrying story that we're looking at 130 plus years until the whole world, reaches true gender equality. Now, obviously, that's the kind of utopia that we're never going to reach, and there's all sorts of different stories within different countries. But, that I think is a very powerful measure of, however people think, oh, we're getting there, we just need to wait a bit, and isn't it wonderful that girls are allowed to go to school, things like that. But we're a long way off.
That figure of 99 to 100 years and getting worse in light of the pandemic is really quite surprising. And,
yeah, I think it's interesting also. Sorry, I was talking over you. I think it's interesting also is that it was the females. The gaps got bigger because females were most impacted. And I think that's an important message as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to go a bit more deeper into the effects of gender, in what ways do those norms and stereotypes affect men and women differently in society?
Oh, well, right. From very early years. I mean, as you know, in my book and other sort of areas, I leap up on my soapbox. We should be aware that children, very, very young children, are picking up gendered cues in society. And from birth, they're responding differently to different social messages. And from the age about 2 onwards, they've picked up the idea that not only there are differences, but these differences are differently valued, and the differences mean different things depending on whether you're a girl or a boy. And that's possibly something we'll get back to. So toys, for example, classic example, age of about 2, boys start rejecting things that are pink or things that are seen as girls' toys. Similarly, girls will go down the pink princess route. And of course, that is being marketed, ferociously marketed. We are starting to draw attention to that. And there's been some very interesting political moves on gendered toy marketing quite recently. But the messages are out there from very early on. And they also have consequences, so that boys' toys tend to be construction toys. So you get quite a lot of practice of constructing, manipulating spatial objects, etc. Whereas girls tend to be much more linked to nurturing and joint play, etc. And so again, you're getting different training opportunities from beginning, and it goes on through schools. You look at stereotyping in primary schools, secondary schools. The careers advice being given to boys and girls, the choices they make in the UK anyway, of subjects they're going to take. And so it goes on, so from a very early age, gender and the expectations that society has and, the messages out there are very clear.
But I think that's a really good place to end this discussion. We've covered what gender is and those differences between gender and sex, how it's changed in recent years as a result of the neuroscientific knowledge and research, and really covered the importance of keeping gender on the agenda in today's society. So in the next episode, we'll look more closely about how that affects children and childhood as well. Thank you for that, Gina. A great episode to end. I would like to say a huge thank you to our guest, Gina Rippon, for joining us and providing such valuable insights. You've been listening to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Shaddai Tembo, and Gina Rippon. If you've been inspired by our conversation today, don't forget you can sign up via the link in our episode notes to be the first to hear about future episodes and accessing exclusive follow-up content, including ideas for your settings and links to relevant resources.